Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Rick Rosso. I hold the Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks everybody for joining today for a conversation about higher education cooperation between the United States and India and what sort of new challenges and opportunities could be presented because of COVID. When we think of successes of U.S.-India relations, a lot of times we think back to some of the historic markers of the last 15 years, such as announcing the civilian nuclear agreement, signing a number of defense partnership agreements, the tremendous growth that we've seen in U.S.-India commercial ties. But at the end of the day, a lot of the momentum that we've got in the relationship is due to the people-to-people ties. And one of the most important elements of people-to-people ties is what happens between higher education partnerships between the United States and India. Indian students coming here, some American students do travel and study in India. The kind of great research partnerships that we see between universities. So people to people, tends to be not necessarily brought up in the same context as nuclear agreement and trade, but it really is a critical part of the underpinning for all the other good things that have been happening in the relationship. And also, while higher education isn't necessarily the only channel, it's been a primary channel for a lot of Indians who choose later to emigrate to the United States. And the growing political clout that the Indian American community has got here in the United States, as evidenced by a certain vice presidential candidate that we have, but also the fact that, again, the relationship really has been bipartisan. When you speak with members of Congress and senators and they talk about the reason that they've chosen to engage India so heavily, a lot of times they'll reference to some really important members of the community back home who are members of the diaspora. So again, a lot of the diaspora got their first taste of the United States by coming on here to study. So higher education, it's great for important challenges in global research. It's great for people-to-people connections. It's really, I think, added to this incredible blend of humanity that exists here in the United States. But COVID presents a challenge in a lot of different ways. We've seen a number of things happening, obviously, with the difficulty in moving people between countries, campuses closing down, U.S. government policy looking at potentially limiting H-1Bs, which a lot of students that come here would love to be able to spend time and work after they study here. So a lot of direct and indirect challenges that we see to higher education cooperation because of COVID. I'm pleased that we've got three terrific speakers to help us kind of unpack what COVID has meant so far for higher education cooperation, as well as what might change and alter, and what might the system look like off into the future. We've got a last-minute change for one of our speakers. Unfortunately, Susan Ross wasn't able to speak on the panel today, but I'm pleased to announce that Catherine Hatta, who had just retired from the State Department last year, and her most recent posting was as Consul General in Hyderabad, which is the busiest consular section in the entire world. So it's great that Kathy was able to come and join the panel. Also, my partner in crime, Dr. Patrick McNamara, who's Director for International Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and Director of the Schwab Center for Israel Jewish Studies in the Middle East. Also a lead of Partnership 2020, the project that's funded by the State Department to improve U.S.-India higher education ties. And also my good friend Linda Liu, who's Vice President of College Board. Linda leads College Board's work to provide education opportunities to students outside the United States to connect with higher education, both in the United States as well as global opportunities. So great to have Kathy, Patrick, and Linda here to help us work through what COVID means for higher education ties. Let me first turn the floor over to Kathy to talk about her time in Hyderabad and what she's seen as kind of the underpinnings on why higher education cooperation is an important and meaningful thing to the United States. So Kathy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rick. It's an honor to be here, and I totally agree with you. It's a very important dynamic in the U.S.-India interpersonal people-to-people ties is our education relationship. And many people believe that the bipartisan support that you mentioned is also due to the very strong connections that we've forged on a number of different levels on a people-to-people basis. So when I was in CG in Hyderabad, we weren't quite the busiest consular section in the world, but we were up there, and we were definitely the number 5th in the world. I think it went down to the number 7th while I was there in terms of the number of student visas that we processed. And we were the number 1 in India. And the reason that study in the United States was so popular among Indians wasn't only for the possible immigration lifeline, which is very important to people in that area of India especially. It was because, you know, a U.S. education was seen as offering a lot of advantages. You could really think for a while before choosing a major. You could experiment with different courses that weren't in your major. There were all sorts of student associations. There's campus life. You know, there are many different aspects to life at an American college or university that was very appealing. They could choose any size institution, area of study, depending on where they were going, area of the country, if they wanted a school that was more urban, more rural. I mean, we had, you know, so many choices for students. And all that was very appealing. So not surprisingly, you know, this is still the case, the number of international students, among all international students in the United States, Indians now are the 2nd largest group after Chinese students. Last I looked, there were just shy of 200,000 Indian students in the United States. I don't know how COVID has affected that. But what was interesting was the rate of growth in Indian students was growing faster than the rate of growth of Chinese students. And for various reasons right now, I think that trend is likely to continue. So as you mentioned, we saw a lot of positive impact, not just because of the, you know, NRI Americans who maintained ties to India, or Kamala Harris's mother, but you know, many Indians who study in the United States do go back to India. And what we found also is they tended to assume, in many cases, leadership positions in whatever field they were in. So it could be politics, business, education itself. I'll never forget, I was at an event, at a graduation ceremony at the local Foreign Languages Institute in Hyderabad, and I was touting the Fulbright program, and I kind of asked how many people, you know, were Fulbrighters, and behind me on the podium, virtually all the faculty members, you know, raised their hands. So these programs are very important. And the most popular minister in my state had gone to business school at Baruch in New York, and he maintained, you know, close affection for the United States for that reason. And then a lot of those ties still remain very important. And the most recent striking example of that is my friends Krishna and Suchitra Ella came back. They had both gone to the University of Wisconsin, worked and lived in the United States for many, many years, and then decided they wanted to serve India. So they went back and founded Bharat Biotech, which is had been notable before now for developing a Zika vaccine that was taken up by the Gates Foundation. And now they, together with University of Wisconsin researchers, so those ties still remain, are racing to develop a COVID vaccine. So these ties, you know, are really great. You know, less satisfying, I would say. You know, there are a couple of aspects. One was that, you know, we found the number of female students who were going to the United States was well below the number of male students. And that was a source of concern for the reasons I just mentioned, you know, who was in the leadership positions, you know, in these various fields. And a lot of it seemed to be security concerns by parents, you know, sending their daughters so far away, because on Indian campuses, as you know, there's just about parity between men and women. So this was troubling to us. And we developed specialized outreach. We did an analysis of the issue, and then we developed specialized outreach, which included parents. And that was having some success, but still, you know, not the level of parity that I would have liked to see. And then also, you know, unsatisfying was the lack of reverse exchanges. You know, I was just looking at the most recent Open Doors report, and the number of American students has actually gone down in India between 1916-17 school year and 1917-18 school year. So again, that was the most recent statistic I could find. But and we're below 4,000, you know, which is you have to look that the fewer American students go overseas than probably should in this globalized world. But that is a tenth of the number who go to the UK, for example. So, and not to knock a UK education, it's fine, but it does give a sense that this is an area of growth. The happy news is, the people I did encounter, the Fulbrighters, for example, were doing great research, great work, setting up those relationships that would be so important, not only for their own future career, but for, the kind of academic exchanges I think we're going to talk about here. And we also hosted English language fellows in India, who would come and teach on university campuses in India. And it was really important, that program, because, for example, one fellow was teaching at a place in Orisha University that's a newer school that specializes in kind of more technical, training, where English language, though, is still very, very important, to hook in. We talk now about supply chains, hooking businesses into the supply chains. A lot of these students were going to go on and work in the kinds of industries that we're talking about now. And that was very important. And then we also, Hyderabad happens to host a national Urdu language university, for Muslim students. And we brought in an English language fellow, and we had a program to teach educators from madrasas, so that they could teach English, to their students and help modernize the curriculum there. So really, there's a lot of important exchanges that are already going on, but definitely room to grow, especially in my view, in that other direction. So I'll sign off here.
Well, thanks, Kathy. That's a lot of angles to it that I think we may not always think about. In particular, I love what you brought up on, the number of Indian students that maybe come to the United States and then go back and take over, such important leadership roles in business and government. I mean, that's a linkage that you just can't replace by any other tool or method that I could think of. Let me turn the floor over now to Patrick, who, apart from his, great role in leading international at University of Nebraska at Omaha, is also the lead for Partnership 2020, which is looking for avenues to try to expand U.S. India higher education ties. So Patrick, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Rick. Kathy, I appreciated your insights into some of the mobility challenges. This Partnership 2020 project is a collaborative agreement between UNO and the State Department, with CSIS playing a major consulting role in this. Rick, thanks to you and your team for all that you brought to the table. The four elements of the Partnership 2020 project include a database of partnerships that exist between U.S. universities and Indian universities. That's literally a map that you can click on the states and see, drill down and see which partnerships in what strategic areas are now in place. There are 220, thanks to Rick's great team there at CSIS, 220 registered partnerships. I would ask any of our viewers, if you look at that partnership2020.org website and know of a partnership that you do not see, please be in touch with us. We can upload. There you go. Hey, Rick, thanks. So if you see a partnership not on there, we would love to know that. There is a place on that website that you can upload your information. And Rick, as you showed there, you can search that database either by state or by subject area or by university. The second major element of our Partnership 2020 project is a policy recommendations paper that is going to be coming out probably late in 2020 this year. And then there is a practical guide for university leaders who want to start and enhance these partnerships. That practical guide will probably be coming out in the next month to 6 weeks. Stay tuned for the release of those two documents. And again, thanks to Rick's team for all the work that you've done on those. Finally, there is a sub-grant opportunity for U.S. universities to apply for grant funding to enhance partnerships in 10 strategic areas. On our website, we have all the information about that. We have done 5 rounds of funding. The money is all spent at this point. We have made 15 grants, and all 10 of the strategic areas that we set out have now been covered in at least one, and in some cases, many of those grant areas. So those grants are being, and they are really across the board. That's been exciting. I've actually made some site visits in India to places that have received the grants, and there are some really excellent projects that are underway there. I will stop there, and I welcome an opportunity to address any of this in the Q&A section. Rick, I also want to give you any opportunity to add anything with regards to our Partnership 2020 project that you want to highlight that I may have missed or not hit on as much.
No, I think you nailed everything that we've had our hands on for this, but it's been a terrific partnership, and certainly, there's going to be a lot of evolution as this project is underway in terms of how these things are going to work. But
yeah,
yep.
to that point, Rick, one of the things that was an element of many of these grants was some mobility. Obviously, with COVID and the question marks about travel, that mobility is being rethought. That's an opportunity for the grantees to think creatively. But it also, if there was some travel in there, means that the scope of work and the budget may have to be revisited in the coming months.
Now, some of the issues that we've uncovered during the interviews that we've done so far, I think what we've seen, the impact in COVID so far, is going to hit it pretty directly. Like, for instance, for U.S. universities that are trying to sign partnerships with Indian counterparts, the idea about engaging in person is so very important. The idea about negotiating these kind of joint projects and doing it via phone, even via video link, a lot of participants in our surveys have said it's a very difficult thing to do that only digitally, only via distance. But clearly that kind of travel isn't going to be quite so easy. And actually that might be something that even as we turn to Linda can give us some advice on, since her cooperative project with Indian universities, she's signing them on at a pretty good clip right now. So Patrick, maybe then I'll turn it over to Linda from College Board, who, clearly College Board is sitting really in kind of the catbird seat for seeing what's happening in terms of students that want to move and all kinds of great cooperation between the United States and India. So Linda, thanks for joining, and let me hand the floor over to you.
Great, thank you, Rick. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me, and Catherine and Patrick. It's so great to hear your comments as well, and all the great work that you are each doing to really further these people-to-people exchanges that Rick was referring to earlier. So the College Board is also doing some work in this area as well, as Rick sort of alluded to. About 2 years ago, we launched a new initiative in India called the India Global Higher Education Alliance. And the purpose of that alliance is to really bring together innovative Indian universities that are doing really interesting things with universities from outside of India to provide a platform where best practices can be shared, where people can have some discussions around how to approach different things. Because I think, as probably many of us on this in the session today know, Indian higher education has seen enormous change in the last decade. And we see, many new universities starting and really serving a very broad population of students in India. But, you know, India as a higher education system is still fairly new. The people who are working within Indian higher education continue to be, you know, kind of newer in their profession. And so having these platforms where we can share best practices and be able to learn from each other, you know, kind of on a global scale is really important. So we're really, really proud of the work that we're doing there. And we've seen a lot of interest from universities across India participating in this. Right now we have about 37 universities in India participating in this alliance. And from outside of India, we have participation across 7 different countries. So that's pretty significant. But what I wanted to share a little bit more today is actually I wanted to go at this from a little bit of a student perspective. So the College Board, you know, our signature programs are SAT, advanced placement, and we really sit at that intersection between K-12 and higher education, focusing on how we connect students to opportunities in higher education. At the same time, we're also a membership-based organization. So working with colleges and secondary schools who are our members, and they span 50 different countries, there is really nothing more important than trying to facilitate these people-to-people exchanges and making sure that there are these platforms for collaboration, for learning from each other. But I think really at the heart of our work and at the heart of the work of, you know, pretty much all of us in education is the student. How do we serve students? How do we help them progress? And when we think about COVID and what the impact of COVID has been, I think it's important to understand that perspective and what are students thinking? How is this impacting their choices and their behavior? So to that end, we actually conducted a survey with international students who engaged with College Board programs at some point to better understand what their plans are in light of the pandemic and what they are thinking right now. We received responses from about 10,000 students, and representation was fairly even across different world regions. In India, we had about 10% of participation, 10% of the respondents were from India. So I think the results are fairly representative of what we're seeing across the world, but also what we're seeing in India. And I'll point out some places where we might have seen some different results from Indian students. So I am going to share my screen right now. And
Yeah, it's working.
It's working? Are we in slideshow mode?
Not yet.
Okay,
I still see your slides as the. Yep, there you go. Perfect.
Okay, just 1 second. Okay, all right, great. So what I wanted to do was share just some key highlights from the survey that we did. So a couple of things. Among this fall's incoming class, so students, international students that are going to be starting college this fall, we see that, this is back in June, so we see that about 20% of those students have withdrawn as a result of COVID. And so, and among Indian students, that number is actually slightly higher. It's at about 25%. And although this is not necessarily a sky is falling scenario, the fact that many US institutions depend on international students for revenue, for adding diversity to their campuses, for adding global perspectives, this is actually fairly significant. And for students who haven't withdrawn, the good news is that the majority of them are planning to attend, with only about 9% telling us that they want to defer their enrollment to a later time. And among Indian students, the deferment rate is fairly consistent. What is actually a little bit different among Indian students is that actually 25% of them were telling us that they're not sure what their plans are, and so they were still trying to figure out what they're going to do. But you know, overall, globally, we're seeing significant interest in continuing to enroll in higher education. Of course, you know, as we pointed out at the beginning of this session, the circumstances are really going to dictate whether or not they can really realize that, interest. And as we see colleges starting to reopen, Patrick mentioned they're reopening next week. I mean, I think very soon we're going to know whether or not these numbers are going to pan out or not. But just from an interest perspective, students really want to go to college this year, and international students want to go to wherever their campuses are that they originally applied to. When we look at whether or not students are actually comfortable with online classes, it's probably not terribly surprising to any of us. They're not comfortable. They don't want to be taking classes online. So even among this very digitally savvy population and generation of students, only 20% of students are saying, I'm pretty comfortable with taking classes online. So, I think there was a point made earlier about the value of in-person interactions. That's not just across partners. Students are saying, I want in-person interactions. I want in-person classes. However, if the only choice in light of this pandemic is that online courses are being offered and that's what students need to be doing, many of them are saying, yeah, I'm going to choose to participate in online courses rather than deferring or withdrawing. So I think, for many universities, they're sitting in this very, very tough space in terms of like, how do you make the right decision? We know kids want to be in classes, but we just can't do it safely. What do we do? I think the good thing is that students are understanding of that, and they're gonna do what's offered to them because they want to be able to participate in college. So when we look, that's largely about the current class, the entering class of 2020. When we look further ahead at younger students, interestingly, what we see is that the overall interest in studying abroad and studying outside of their home country is actually quite high. We did a similar survey back in November 2019, just 6 months ago, and you can see between November and June, we see a 6-point increase in terms of students saying, I want to study abroad, I want to study outside of my country. And this is particularly the case among younger students. I think this really speaks to aspiration. So, students want to leave their borders and have more of these global experiences. I think there's also a positivity here with the younger students in particular, in terms of thinking that, hey, we should be done with the pandemic by then. I should be able to still go to college in a year and 2 years, etc. So I think that's reflected in some of these numbers here as well. The not so good news for those of us on this call working in the US is that among students who are planning to study abroad, the proportion considering the US has declined fairly significantly. So in November, we saw 88% of students saying they want to come to the US. Now it's at 79%. And so the key things that are driving some of this decline, health and safety concerns regarding the pandemic, also the financial hardships that have been created as a result of the pandemic. And the survey was done in June. We were also sort of in the middle of the protests. And so the political climate and current events are also influencing this as well. But I think that because of this, cooperation between the US and other countries is really more important than ever at this time, in order to make sure that students understand they're welcomed, institutions want them here on their campuses, and we're here to support them. And this last piece, and then I'll kind of sum it up a little bit and talk about the so what. I wanted to share a little bit in terms of what students are really valuing and kind of how they're making their decisions when they're thinking about where they want to apply. And you can see here, this was mentioned earlier, personal safety is really important, and the number 3 factor in terms of students when they're evaluating which colleges to apply. We see this number even higher for Indian students, and so it is really no surprise that the interest in the U.S. at this time is waning a little bit. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're hearing from students at this point. And let me stop sharing. So what exactly does all of this mean? I think for us, knowing that there remains a significant interest among international students to go abroad, a strong desire for these in-person experiences, but that we are really, really much constrained by on-ground realities, I think it's more important than ever for all of us to collaborate across borders to figure out how can we continue to support student ambitions in really creative ways during these challenging times. And so I wanted to share just a couple of things that the College Board is doing, and perhaps that can spark some other ideas from others as well. But for us, we really wanted to figure out how we do two things, continue to do two things really well. One is getting students prepared for college, and then second is connecting them to those opportunities. So on the preparation front, again, we think it's more important than ever for students to have opportunities to take rigorous coursework like advanced placement. And we know schools want that for kids as well. We know universities continue to value the strength of those programs. So this spring, when the pandemic really hit us in the middle of March, we were about 6 weeks away from the start of AP exams. We typically administer them in school, paper and pencil. Well, that wasn't going to happen this year. So in the space of 6 weeks, we transitioned from the model that we have been using for the last 50, probably even longer than that, 70 years, to administer AP exams, to a at-home version of the exam that students can take at home digitally. So if you asked me at the beginning of 2020 whether I thought AP exams could ever be offered digitally, I would have said to you that optimistically, we're probably a decade away from that. The pandemic shrunk that down to 6 weeks. So, I think we're all kind of dealing with the same thing, like, oh my God, we have to, do things differently now on such a different timeline, which in some ways is very positive, right? Things that we have wanted to do for years and years. Now there's an impetus for doing that. So I think that in some ways is a little bit of a blessing in disguise. And this fall, in order to continue to support schools and really support the fact that we're going to see a lot of virtual instruction, either in a hybrid mode or a fully online mode, we're introducing new tools and resources to help teachers be more effective. And this is to really help supplement their instruction in the classroom. Again, we designed all of these tools in a very short period of time. And one thing that we're launching this year is something called AP Daily, where we've recruited the best AP teachers in the world, as well as professors, to record lessons that teachers can use in their classrooms. So really trying to leverage technology and kind of the environment that we're in to deliver something that we think would be helpful for students as well as for teachers. And then on the member side of things, and on the kind of convening side of things, we've been hosting roundtables with our, in particular, India Global Alliance members to share lessons learned, share things about what we're doing. There are no answers because everybody's sort of dealing with a very uncertain situation, but the fact that we're able to exchange ideas and share has also been really positive. And then lastly, in terms of connecting students to higher education, we've also had to think about new things that we've never done before that we should be doing during this environment. So just as an example, the College Board before the pandemic has never done things like college fairs to connect students and universities. But in this environment where, as we've mentioned before, where nobody's traveling, we think it's really important to be able to have those opportunities for higher education institutions to be able to connect with international students. So about a week and a half ago, we hosted a virtual college fair with members of our India Global Alliance, and we ended up having 15,000 students and parents register for the event. If you, again, if we had tried to do this in an in-person environment, no way would we have ever gotten those numbers. And if you had asked me whether or not we would even consider doing that if it was in person, we probably would not. It's just not really core to our work. But during this time, there are those opportunities. And I think, really thinking more innovatively, more nimbly about what can we do. Things are not perfect at this time, but how could we continue to kind of serve and do these things that are very core to our mission and the work that we do is really important. And I know that many higher ed institutions are doing similar things on their end, in particular leveraging cross-border collaborations and working with universities partners in different parts of the world to, for example, kind of hosting their first year international students for this first semester before trying to bring them onto campus again in light of the situation that we're in right now. So I do think that continuing to push on these collaborations and really thinking more creatively about what we can do is just so important at this time. So with that, back to you, Rick.
Yeah, great. And that's a tremendous amount of data too that you provided us, Linda, from your survey. So thanks again for bringing that to the table. Really, really quite enlightening. One issue that came up, I think, a couple of times already, is the idea about getting more American students to consider India as a study abroad destination. Kathy, you'd mentioned this. I mean, when you think about the institutions that you visited there and the welcoming and sort of accommodation, what are some of the barriers that you think might limit the number of U.S. students? Is it simply lack of awareness? Is it the living facilities? Is it examinations? I mean, what are some of the things that keep more American students away from traveling India? I'll start with Kathy, and then Linda or Patrick, if you have thoughts on this as well.
I mean, my guess is just not seen as there's not enough information about it out there, and our relationship with India, while we who work on U.S.-India relations know it's becoming more and more important, I don't think it's reached that level of recognition yet. And as someone who many years ago, when it was still kind of an unusual thing to do, studied Chinese, as a young adult, and the amount of exchanges now between U.S. and China were inconceivable. I mean, it was not an exaggeration to say that I knew virtually everyone, through my circles, or knew someone who had studied in China, at that time. And now, you look at how things have changed. So I'm fairly confident the same thing will happen with India when our partnership, becomes even more robust than it already is.
And I would add, I think I would totally agree with Kathy. I think the awareness front is a pretty significant issue here. I think even things like knowing that you don't need to necessarily speak Hindi to study abroad in India is something that not everybody knows. And I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that in the last decade, I mean, Indian higher education has seen a lot of change, and I don't think that is clear to students. And so I think, probably better promoting higher education in India and how that has changed is important. The other thing that I think is important, Kathy referenced earlier, the open doors data. And in that data, I think we see that the top fields for study abroad are actually in STEM. And while I think, the IIEs continue to be king in India and have global prominence, I think students in these fields are perhaps looking for more research-based opportunities, which at the moment are not necessarily as widespread in India. But I think this new national education policy may help in that regard.
I would just add, echoing what Linda said, that I think that the new education policy is opening up a lot of exciting possibilities. I will tell one cautionary story in response to Rick's question. We had a UNO student who wanted to study abroad in India, and we found a good partner and placed her in a study abroad. It was meant to be a year. And once she got there, the hostels, the dormitories, were not up to what she had hoped for. And then she started getting some unwanted attention from one of the security guards at the hostel. And there was whether or not this was, cultural misunderstanding, I don't know. But then the administration didn't take her complaints and questions seriously, and she ended up feeling unsafe in this living environment. And we ended up having to first place her in a hotel where, you know, she could finish her classes, but then we transferred her to a different university in a different city. Thankfully, that all worked out. But I tell this story to illustrate how, especially for a young woman going to India, she didn't feel particularly comfortable in the living situation. And so there are some basic things like housing, some basic assumptions that people make about when they're coming as an American and some of that may be misplaced, but some of that is reality that needs to be addressed with regards to Indian universities. So I tell that short story just to illustrate that there are challenges in the mobility going both ways.
Yeah. For participants on the call, you can, I see a number of people already have, but you can log questions in. There's a Q&A toggle at the bottom of your screen, so you can log questions in that way. It's a bit easier than following the side conversation on chat, where, you know, it tends to be sort of comments on what speakers have said and stated. Let me ask a question on digitization. I think it's come up a couple of times on how classes can be conducted digitally, and Linda, some great data you had there, but also the proctoring of examinations. How much of this is going to be, you know, a short-term bump, both for, you know, examinations as well as for teaching classes? How much of it, you know, do you think could actually trigger residual changes in how digital, you know, influences higher education ties? And I think also, you know, it's important too, like, you know, internet penetration in India. You know, when you think about running classes and stuff, you need a certain level of bandwidth, which is going to play into this as well. So how much of the digital evolution is going to be there for a while? How much of that is going to be a bit more transitory, and people are sort of eager and getting back to the old ways of doing business? Again, both for classes as well as for conducting examinations. So Linda, you talked about that dramatic transition you went through, sort of the decade agenda compacted into a couple of months. I wonder if you can kind of lead off, and then maybe I'll ask Patrick and then Kathy if she has thoughts.
Yeah, no, I do think that digital is here to stay. I think what we're probably going to need to do, you know, going forward, is to really think about how we adapt the model of learning in order to fit, you know, kind of a digital world. But I do think that elements of it are certainly going to be in place. And so what I mean by that is, when we think about the curriculum, we've designed the curriculum so that, you know, the teacher is in front of a classroom teaching students, and students grasp the material. That's the model that we created. That's the model that works well, because that's what students are used to. When you try to do that in a digital environment, it just doesn't work, because it was never meant to work in a digital environment. So I think when we think about the curriculum, some of the things that we are thinking about, you know, kind of longer term, is how do we really make that work? Because, you know, Rick, I think as you were alluding to, we also have to consider the fact that we've got a digital divide. And even if we have significant, you know, numbers of students with devices, we really, or internet penetration, we also have to think about the reliability of those connections, right? I mean, I think at any point, probably all of us have experienced being kicked out of the Zoom room, where, you know, you know, like, oh my God, how do I get back in?
I'm just waiting for it to happen at my events here, you know, just I'm sweating a little bit, but
exactly. You're like, who's playing a game? He was taking up the internet bandwidth in my house. So, you know, that is all happening. And I think what we probably need to really think about is, okay, well, how do we design the curriculum so that we don't expect students to be in person with the teacher for 6 hours, 7 hours, right? And it may be more around, like, thinking about project-based work, where, you know, there is a little bit of instruction, but really, you know, students are guided to work on specific projects, and they can, you know, apply their creativity, and there's checks along the way, so that you don't require this constant, like, you know, kind of a synchronous mode of learning. So that, I think, is one thing. I think the other thing that we should think about and when we talk about collaboration is that, you know, in addition to institutions collaborating with each other and across borders, I think this is also a time to really think about how, you know, we collaborate with the tech providers. So one of the things that we did as part of the AP administration this year, knowing that, you know, students were going to have differential access to technology, either in terms of devices or in terms of, you know, internet connectivity, we actually had a separate project, fairly significant project, trying to work with partners like Amazon, like Sprint, in order to get access points to students who needed it, to get devices to students who needed it. So we were actually, we had a form that students could fill out to tell us like, hey, I can't take my AP exams this year because I don't have a device, or internet connectivity is really no good where I am. And we responded to those requests, and we worked with the you know, partners on the tech side in order to be able to get those devices and get those hotspots and things like that out to students. So I do think that, you know, there is great opportunity for collaboration across education as well as corporates at this time.
Thanks. Yeah. Patrick, you mentioned, you know, you'll be open on campus, but doing some classes digitally. What are your thoughts? How much of this is going to be sticky after the fact, and how much of it is going to be transitory, you know, once COVID is at some point behind us?
I don't know the answer to that, Rick. And I think, you know, my crystal ball isn't working great this morning, but I have a couple of thoughts echoing what Linda said. And one is that we all, in my experience, especially India, needs to rethink the curriculum and the delivery if we are going more online. I have taught for the past 9 years a short course on social entrepreneurship to MBA students at a business school outside of Delhi in Noida. And I was supposed to go last month and teach that for a 10th year in a row, but that is not happening. They have asked me to teach that class online to their MBA students. I am, I said yes, but I also am rethinking what that delivery, not only the curriculum itself, but also the modes of delivery. And I think mixing some of that synchronous and asynchronous, because as most of us who have done, you know, higher education work in India know, a lot of the mode is lecture mode. And if you're asking students to sit for hours on, you know, Zoom or whatever and listen to lectures, wow, I pity them. So I keep thinking, how can we make this more interactive? We do have some tools, and there are certainly some great resources out there for more interactive and innovative teaching online. And I hope that India also is thinking about this. One of the things that our colleague Susan Ross from the State Department sent a little bit of information, highlighted some of the digital divide, rural and urban, but interestingly also women and men, girls and boys, in terms of the students and the access that students have to information and to digital accessibility. So all of that are things that we need to continue to keep on the front burner as we think about going digital, whether that's in the US, in India, or anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. Kathy, anything you want to add on this point?
Yes, just a few points based not only on my experience of India, but believe it or not, when I was working at the State Department's own school, the Foreign Service Institute, where I was an associate dean some years ago. We had become, at that time, very intrigued by something we call it sort of flip teaching, which is that, you know, there is an instructor, and my educator friends are nodding their heads, so I think they know what this is, but you give students the assignment first, you give them the homework first, and then you go over the material the next day. And it occurs to me that with online education, that might be one way that would be helpful because people are already engaged with the issue before they log on. So I have no doubt there'll be more good ideas like that. In terms of experience in India, some years before I arrived there, our consulate in Kolkata hosted MOOCs, online, with schools in the United States. What they found was it was helpful. This is a hybrid that doesn't really work in a pandemic setting necessarily, but if we're really thinking long-term future, international, digital education, what they found was by bringing the students together to watch that online course, it actually was very helpful. It gave them some kind of support and incentive to keep going. And what they found was that students were much more likely to continue with that course if they were together in a room, watching that program. I saw the same model in a private institution, at English language primarily, but not only, institution in Hyderabad, where they were linking up with educators in the United States. They would have a classroom of students. It's important too, because students, as we know, benefit from other students, and the conversations and the side conversations that they can have. It's the same in the business world. We can go digital, but we're going to lose that spontaneity. This puts back a little bit of that spontaneity. The last thing I would note, which is kind of incredible, the issues of digital divide are very real, but India might offer us, some examples of how to overcome them, even as they're trying to address them themselves. And the example I'm thinking of is a tribal school, again in Orisha, that would, it was a boarding school for about 30,000 students. And then they would send them home over the summer. And what they found was when they came back the next semester, they had fallen way behind, not just academically, but just in personal lifestyle, issues. So what they started to do was online education for them, in the summer. I'd have to check back to see how it went. But the fact is there are people working on these issues already in India, and they could even serve to be a model for us here.
Oh, thanks. We've got a couple of questions in, even though when we first started talking about this panel event, it was mostly, of course, about COVID, but of course, an important thing has happened in India, even while this whole thing's been underway, which is the final approval from Cabinet for the new education policy. For those that haven't seen it, my colleague Kriti Upadhyay had put out, I think, an important piece noting that, Cabinet passage of the new education policy is not the same thing as ultimate introduction of all of its elements. There's still a lot of legislative work and things that have to happen. But this also may be the thing that finally cracks open the door to allow more U.S. universities to establish a formal presence in India that I think has gotten probably the most attention in the U.S. India lane. So I wonder for the panelists, do you think that there's some really pending floodgate of U.S. universities that want to set up satellite campuses in India, or how is this going to change the face? And are there other elements of the new education policy that you're tracking that are going to improve maybe U.S.-India collaboration, even apart from this idea about the ability for universities potentially later to set up campuses? I know, Linda, if you want to start off, Patrick, Kathy, but new education policy, is it going to change the face of U.S.-India cooperation? Is there still so much more work to be done that is pretty unclear? I don't know if you have any thoughts. Love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things here in terms of U.S. universities or other foreign universities going into India and starting up branch campuses. I do think that what's in the policy is going to help with enabling that. I think, and when we kind of look at what's happened over the last 20 years, globally, we've seen universities opening up overseas branch campuses triple over this 20-year period. So there's certainly interest in terms of having overseas campuses. But I think in the middle of COVID, where we are going to be challenged with, and love to hear thoughts from others, is, one is the financial constraints, right? Campuses are just going to be facing a lot of financial pressures, no matter where you are, just because of the situation that we're seeing right now. They're investing heavily to try to transform their campuses in order to be able to educate students safely. That's taking up resources, right? And so at this time, to think about opening up a campus overseas, I think is, maybe viewed as we might do that in 2-3 years when we're a little bit more stable. So I think that's kind of be in the short term something that we would deal with. The other piece of the national education policy that I think will be helpful as far as just allowing for these this possibility, at least from a U.S. standpoint, is the fact that it is moving to more of a 4-year model. It's not necessarily streamed, which is much more closer to the American model, which make it a little bit easier to kind of take what you're competent in and what you're an expert in the U.S. and try to do similar things abroad and introduce those programs. I think the current structure, which is largely 3-year programs, very much focused on specific disciplines, is a little bit, it's not as great a fit for U.S. universities.
Yeah, thanks. Patrick, Kathy, anything you want to add on NEP and what it means for the U.S. India lane?
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of the practicality of doing it or when you do it, I don't really have a lot to add on that. I think in terms of the potential of the benefits to Indian students, I think it's quite enormous, especially given what we were just discussing about women students, that, I think it would be much more likely that they would be allowed to attend a university, in the locality in which they are, than having all the worries. And it relieves a lot of the financial pressure as well, on these students. It really is quite expensive for a lot of, less well-to-do Indian families to contemplate going overseas the way it would be, for our students to contemplate going overseas. So that, I think that would help with a lot of that as well. And it might even spark some kind of innovation and more exchange between institutions to have that kind of presence.
I like Kathy's optimistic note that she ended on there, but I share some of Linda's pessimistic views that first of all, U.S. universities are not ready, and I don't think financially in the next couple of years at least. I guess I should speak from University of Nebraska perspective. We are a state university, and so although only a percentage of our budget comes from state dollars, I think there is more risk aversion in many U.S. universities to expenditures that may or may not have an ROI at the end. I also just want to highlight one point that Michael Anderson made in the questions about the bureaucracy of India. And those of us who have done work for many years in India know that also is a real or perceived barrier to U.S. universities entering into that space. Even with a NEP, new education policy, there's still a lot of question marks about what that looks like in an implementation.
That's perfect. I got a separate private question on exactly that same topic. So, what will happen with actual implementation on the ground? We got another question I can just answer real quick in terms of the best practices and the policy papers we're working on under Partnership 2020. The best practices is really a practical guide for U.S. universities that are thinking about initiating new partnerships in India. Basically, we interviewed more than 20 U.S. institutions that have existing partnerships and asked them, what would you counsel your peers if they're looking at doing the same? So it's kind of like, here's some tips of the trade that others have learned on how you can go about initiating partnerships. The second document, the policy guide, are policy recommendations for the two governments in terms of steps the governments can take that should help to expand the number of U.S.-India higher education partnerships. So as Patrick mentioned, the best practices guide will be coming out in the next month and a half, and the policy guide will come out closer to the end of the year, most likely. The interviews are all done, but we're just pulling it into a comprehensible form. But thanks for the question on that issue.
Can I make one other point about the policy paper in particular there, Rick? And that is my good friend, Dr. Adi Dam, who is a colleague at University of Nebraska with me, talks about the importance of policies regarding, visas, H-1Bs, and, the OPT that's allowed for students for a short period. That is so crucial to India. That's the selling point. One of the major selling points of Indian Indian students coming, not only Indians, but many students coming as international students to the US. And so I just want to highlight how important those policies are going forward. And I hope that we are in a positive place with regards to creating a welcoming space for US students and workers after their students. Kathy, do you want to add something to that?
I'm into that. I totally agree. It's a tremendously important program. And, I do think it probably was due for a review of some kind to make sure everyone was filling the objectives of the actual program. The issues that have been uncovered are not unserious issues, but I think it's so important to maintain that openness. We benefit, in my view, and our economy benefits also from these programs. So we really need to find ways to keep them.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific. I think I think we've picked out a number of I think really important topics here. Basically, as Linda highlighted through the data, I think the intentions of a lot of international students to study abroad, and particularly the United States, remain strong, though a bit of a dip in terms of the United States. I think the actual in practice, we've seen some changes, obviously. And I think another point that was throughout this is how much of the shift to digital is going to be sticky later on. And again, Linda, the data you presented that shows that like students' lack of interest in digital learning, frankly, whether or not students, I think, become more comfortable over time being forced to do this, may ultimately be the trigger on whether or not for testing and for classes, if this is going to be sticky or not. If they end up and are quite comfortable with it, and it looks like it's something that they're willing to do, and it reduces costs for those that want to convey both education and testing that way. So could be demand ultimately as drivers of this. I know from my own experience with the 10-year-old here, 6 months into distance learning, he's still not as comfortable with the digital classroom as he was in person. So as you mentioned rightly, that if kids who spend a lot more time on computers than I did at that age, if they're not adapting to it, then there may be a bit of a snapback to the old models, even though digital on paper makes a lot of sense in some critical ways. But Kathy, Linda, Patrick, thanks a lot for giving us some time this morning and sharing your thoughts in terms of what COVID's impact has been so far and changes that we might see in higher education cooperation. I think probably a longer separate conversation on ultimately what we see from the new education policy is probably in order as well. And in fact, I know there's a separate video conference event happening right now from another U.S. institution talking about the national education policy. So a lot of topics happening, but I think it only serves to underscore, as Kathy pointed out at the beginning, higher education cooperation, student movement. It is one of the most vital aspects of U.S.-India relations. We've got a bit of an issue that we're dealing with COVID right now, but great organizations like College Board have found ways to adapt. And Patrick will be back in the classroom, living this out himself in a very real way. So thanks all for your partnership and cooperation and joining us this morning. And look forward to catching up with everybody again real soon.
Thank you. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.